When we were talking to Slavoj, he said something interesting. He was talking about Squid Game and The Handmaid's Tale, and he pointed out that a lot of films and TV, which are sort of marketed to liberal audiences and claim to be critical of some sort of system of oppression. So, obviously, in the case of Squid Game, that's capitalism, and in the case of Handmaid's Tale, that's patriarchy. He pointed out that when these shows or movies are like over the top gratuitous, as I think I actually haven't seen Squid Game, but with Handmaid's Tale, for instance, you see all of these terrible scenes of oppression of women, sexual assault, so on and so forth. Slavoj pointed out that because sometimes these depictions veer toward the gratuitous, it sort of ends up having the opposite effect where the film or the movie claims to be critiquing a certain system, but at the same time, the audience is still allowed to indulge in sort of like a regressive desire. Like, oh my God, it's so horrible what I'm watching. I can't believe I'm seeing this. But of course, you're enjoying the film or TV show that you're watching and you continue to watch it anyway, right? So I thought that was a really interesting point. And it, of course, made me think about horror movies, which I think sort of fit that description to a T. In the case of horror movies, unlike Handmaid's Tale, like most of the time horror movies are not actually explicitly critiquing some sort of system of oppression, although we do see horror movies like that, and we will talk about that in a second. But why do we watch horror movies, right? Like, are we indulging some sort of regressive pleasure or desire? I think that you can make that case in a way because, and I think that you can see that most clearly in the fact that people in horror movies, the characters in horror movies, are very often dumb, insufferable, or just like very flat. So it's not actually a tragedy when, they meet their end. And I think that is kind of part of the pleasure of watching horror movies. And I have more to say about this, but I want to get your guys' thoughts first, just to kind of kick off. Do we watch horror movies because we're sadists?
Yeah, probably on some level. I mean, there's definitely that part of us there that we tap into, and it's like, and it feels thrilling, right? It's like almost like a rush of adrenaline when you're doing something wrong. It's engaging in a taboo. I mean, that's what's like, part of the thrill of like sexual taboos and things like that. Like, is that the whole point is that you're doing something wrong. That you're not supposed, that is not right, correct, or moral, or anything like that, and that unleashes within your body like just a hit of adrenaline and dopamine, and you're just like, this shit is fucking crazy. And I think that that's part of it's a version of like why we also I don't know, like spicy food or something, where it's like it's engaging in a sort of safe version of pain, sadism on ourselves that doesn't leave any marks or anything like that. It like releases adrenaline, and that's why we love it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just is the case, and not to like go too much into psychology either, but like I think it just is the case that like we all have an aggressive drive inside of us that to some extent, and the whole thing is that like these are like drives. Again, I don't want to go too much into this, but like drives are like unconscious processes. And so like that's where like when you have a desire for something, a desire might actually be for something that you consciously are like, I really don't actually want that thing, but you keep getting drawn to it, or you keep thinking about it. It keeps coming back to you. And so you can have desires and fantasies that are actually really kind of disgusting and gross or unpleasurable or unwanted. In fact, I bet most of you do have those, because that's just kind of what it's like to be a person. And so especially in our society, like you are socialized in a way where like these kind of things end up inevitably inside of us. And so I do think horror films, it's like one of the very few ways in society where we can like appropriately like face these things, like, but at a distance, that we don't actually have to deal with the actual fantasy or desire that you have in your head. But you can momentarily, I think like the fact that these characters are typically so flat, they're effectively a mask for us that like that we put on, that we get to be the really superficial flat character with no history, no dimensionality. And now we're experiencing the really horrible bad thing, or the rush of that experience. And it kind of alleviates some of that pressure that is building up inside of you, where you go, okay, I can feel this, and now I can go back to being a normal person, where I no longer have to actually deal with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, I think that part of the transgressive pleasure of the horror movie is not just the sadism, but it's masochism too, right? Like, I have a good friend who hates horror movies, and whenever I ask her if she wants to watch one with me, she's like, why would I spend an hour and a half crying and shaking? And it's like, yeah, like horror movies, like the adrenaline doesn't just come from like being excited that there's like blood and gore like happening. It's also being literally afraid. Like a good horror movie
Yeah.
is one that actually is scary, I think.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that's if it doesn't scare you, if it doesn't make you feel something. I mean, that's the other thing I think, like, is like we're so numb, by the torrent of content all the time, and um the horror genre, when you watch it, actually kind of makes you feel something, and that's these days it's not easy to come by. Like back in the day, you could feel something by playing with sticks or whatever.
Back in
Now
1920.
we can't do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you
Yeah.
can't do that.
I want to quickly shout out a book I really love. It's called Men, Women, and Chainsaws, and it's by the film studies professor Carol Clover. I think it's actually pretty famous. It's an academic work that's like grounded in Lacanian psychoanalysis. So like I'm going to try to paraphrase it. It'll of course be pretty crude. But Carol Clover was the theorist who came up with the term final girl, which I think lots of people are probably pretty familiar with. The final girl, of course, is a horror movie trope where, the last woman standing after all the other teens have been killed off is, I think like Laurie Strode in Halloween is the quintessential example, right? And actually, Laurie Strode is such a final girl that like the Halloween franchise is still going on. There's a Halloween movie this year, and she's still alive. So,
and it's a huge like box office success, like a huge.
Oh, is it?
The movie costs like they make them for very cheap. It costs like $20 million, and I think it made $50 million in its first weekend, which was like astonishing. Whereas like other movies that were supposed to be bigger kind of disappointed, and whenever like the Halloween Kills movie, which got very bad reviews,
sure.
critically panned, was a massive box office success in a year where box office successes are hard to come by.
I haven't seen it yet. I'm not going to lie. I probably will soon. I saw the last Halloween, which I think was called like Halloween, like 2020 Extreme or so. I don't know. Like it was, again, an installment of like Michael Myers is long dead, or so we thought, but like here he is again. Jamie Lee Curtis was in that one too. But what I wanted to say about the final girl is, Carol Clover her work is really interesting because she writes in the early 90s. So this is after like a big wave of 80s slasher horror movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and all the faves. And her argument is with regard to the final girl is essentially that, lots of people tend to look at these 80s slasher movies as movies that are like a little bit sexist, right? I mean, you usually see, like slutty co-eds like running around and like getting killed. And like on the surface, that does seem pretty sexist. But her argument is that because the protagonist or because the last woman standing is always this final girl, it sort of has the opposite effect where, back in the 80s, the kind of predominantly teenage male audience for these movies would actually end up coming to identify with this female protagonist. So there was kind of like a little bit of a gender reversal or like gender subversion going on in those movies. And I really like that interpretation. I think that it's true. I will say also that I know that a lot of women say they identify with the killers a lot of the time. So I think that it's not as like, I'm not saying anything about myself. I'm just telling you what I've heard.
I've heard that too. I mean, I listen, I work for a studio and I run their podcasting. And if you look at podcasting listening stats, dominated absolutely by true crime genre, usually a man killing women. And the audience is like overwhelmingly women, like to a degree that is, and I don't know what it says about the contemporary woman, but that is the fact of the listenership is absolutely true. No, and what you're talking about, the gender subversions of that era of horror movies. I mean, I think that one of my favorite movies, we were talking about it before, is Carrie, the Brian De Palma film, which came out in 1976 at the sort of height of the ERA debate, women's lib, all that stuff. And, some people have criticized that movie as being kind of misogynist for the opening scene in which Carrie, all the women are naked in the girls' locker room. High school girls naked in the girls' locker room, and then Carrie gets her first period and kind of freaks out, and then they all make fun of her. But you could also look at it as a kind of ironic commentary, like the fact that Carrie has like this kind of inert power, like or in like this kind of insane power within her, could be kind of like a ironic making fun of people who are like afraid of women in the ERA kind of time, and the women, like people who are like, oh, you can't let a woman, like, they got like some freaky shit going on in there, like, and Brian De Palma's like, yeah, they do.
I feel the same way about Rosemary's Baby, honestly. I mean, obviously, lots of people don't like Roman Polanski. We all know the history of Roman Polanski. Rosemary's Baby, a classic movie. I mean, like, I still love it, obviously. And I think that much like Carrie, there is an interpretation of that movie that's very focused on like, the horror of the female body, like pregnancy, like what is it? Like an alien thing growing inside you, like what's going on with ladies? Like, like what's Mia Farrow doing? Why did she cut her hair? Like something's really amiss. But I think at the same time, like you were saying about Carrie, it seems like a lot of that movie is actually about subverting that fear, right? It's like, what is the fear? It's Satan. Surprise.
Well, it's also
like the problem isn't women.
Right. I mean, the other thing is that part of the problem is the way that, like, we're kind of already, and we'll continue more to kind of talk about like how most kind of typical liberals approach horror and these kind of critiques of like, is it feminist, anti-feminist? Is it indulging in, the worst of us? Is it like promoting bad thoughts or like bad, fantasies that like people shouldn't be engaged in? Like if you show them violence, will they then become violent or something, violent against women or whoever? But like the thing is, like, you have to start with the fact that, we are highly socialized creatures, that were born probably, underdeveloped. By the time we still have to be highly dependent on our parents for the first few years of our lives, and then, throughout childhood, in a different capacity. But, the things that affect us in life, the way that we are actually socialized, the way that our unconscious is created over time, like how it's developed through experiences that you really don't have much control over. Someone does something to you, or you witness something, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Something doesn't make sense and you're trying to make sense of it. All these, everyone has some combination of these things that have largely shaped how they actually, like, what are they attracted to? What are they fearful of? What are they fantasizing about? Whatever. Like that's the complexity of like the human brain and of like the unconscious. And so I think like fantasy, like why some people really like it and some people, or horror rather, why some people really like horror and some people really don't. I mean, I think a lot of it just comes down to that weird configuration. And for women, that like, standard, like the actual, like how women are treated in society has changed pretty radically over the last few decades. And so the fact that like that transformation has coupled with a very strange psychological reaction, both within women and in men, and is then expressed in horror, which is largely there to, it's not that functionally is there, but it ends up kind of capturing a lot of, how do we understand these changes that are like fearful or strange, the taboos, the things that like we don't typically have any other outlet to talk about in society otherwise. But then you get the weird, this weird stew of things where, like it makes total sense to me why, like, a lot of women, I don't know how many women, but a lot of women would be interested in true crime stories or would identify with killers. It's because all our unconsciouses are weird.
Yeah.
I can say all this and preface, I'm still like a vulgar Marxist class reductionist. So just we can hold both ideas in our head at the same time.
Yeah. Cale's still really vulgar. He just also likes The Shining.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask you guys if you feel like horror sort of simply reflects, I guess, the collective social anxieties of its time period. Because One horror subgenre that I'm not a fan of, but that I was thinking about recently is torture porn, like the Hostel and like Saw and like what else? Like Human Centipede franchises that kind of exploded in popularity like post 2000. I believe it was a New York Magazine critic who dubbed this subgenre torture porn. And I can't remember who it was, but somebody pointed out, at a later date that these movies are actually coinciding with the time period when the US is actually torturing people.
Yeah.
Like in the post 9/11, like Iraq hellscape. So I don't know. That's pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah, no, I find it, the torture thing, I never was a fan of those movies either. It just seemed kind of like it lacked a certain depth or something that I found just to be like, or like it was just so too obvious like what they were going to. Let me just up the ante as much as possible on this specific thing rather than anything thematic or story wise. It's just like, what is the most possible painful, gross thing I can portray on camera? We're just going to keep upping the ante on that, including making like 3 Human Centipede movies. Right. But I just did you guys watch Paul Schrader's The Card Counter with Oscar Isaac that came out this year?
No, not yet.
No, I really want
to. It is. You have to watch it like tonight. It is like it's like the best movie this year by a lot. And the whole premise is that Oscar Isaac was an Abu Ghraib, one of the Abu Ghraib criminals, and now he's dealing with it or whatever. And it just kind of what moved me a lot about that movie was that we know, like in the words of Obama, like we tortured some folks, so we know that, like, you and I, we all know that. We've seen it in the news or whatever, but like, have we really stopped and thought about it for like more than we probably want to? Like, no. Right. And like Paul Schrader's like, no, you should stop and think about it. Mm-hmm. And then he like shows us the scenes in Abu Ghraib, and they're like absolutely unsettling and horrifying and very well done in a very kind of unique way. I left that movie thinking like, we just kind of totally glossed over that, didn't we? We just kind of moved on that we did that, and no one thinks about it. And he's like, no, we got to think about it. And the torture porn genre might be a way for us to just kind of be like, oh, it's not that bad. We can watch a movie about it.
Right. Yeah.
No, I think, my attitude on a lot of movies and art, I don't want to say all art, but I think the bulk of it is just very reflective of the society that it's in, that is being created in. It's not, most art is not like truly progressive in the sense that it's like trying to like propose something else. It's really just kind of highlighting like what are actual, ideas or, or like what is like ideologically present today or whenever the movie is made. And so I think, I basically agree with Nando that I think a lot of the torture porn stuff is basically just like a way of like avoiding the actual torture that exists. That it's a way to like understand it in like a really warped and kind of like it's because it doesn't no one leaves a torture porn movie thinking like, wow, like we need to do something about torture. That's
right. Yeah.
Like, we should try to live in a world where people don't torture one another like that. But it also, again, like, it both deals with the social, but it also just is kind of the, like, again, our drives and desires and fantasies and whatever, which are also socially created to a great extent. But, like how it then affects us individually of like how we then end up wanting, or how we end up aggressive or, like wanting to hurt others. And it kind of, it plays with that part of us as well. And, but it's just, again, it's not, art can't really, like, there's not ever going to be a movie that like is so successful at depicting torture that everyone who sees it is like, we are
must
now
shut down
going
Guantanamo.
to, they're like come out like organizers.
Right. If you like this video from the Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.